Mike Pompeo's first trip as Secretary of State included stops in Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Discussions about Iran topped his agenda. So what steps should be taken to overthrow the Islamic theocracy and restore democracy to the Iranian people? Well, joining us is Misagh Parsa. He's a sociology professor at Dartmouth College and author of the book Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed and How It Might Succeed. Okay, Dr. Parsa, first, some of us remember the Shah, but has Iran ever really had a democracy? And if so, why did it fail?
Democracy became possible as a result of 1941 invasion of Iran by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And the United States helped to establish a sort of democratic institutions during that time, which lasted until 1953. But the most democratic part of it, really, that period from 1941 to 1953, was mostly from 1951 to 1953. And then that came to an end as a result of oil dispute between Iran and Great Britain. The United States ended up intervening and overthrowing Dr. Mossadegh and putting an end to democratic institutions.
And we saw the Green Revolution crushed in 2009. More recently, the protests late last year, and I think they even went into January a little bit. How could a pro-democracy movement actually succeed in Iran?
I argue in the book that it would be very difficult for Iranians to achieve democracy without another fundamental change, which I call it a revolution for lack of another term. So the regime that's in power in Iran actually is more repressive than the regime that it replaced. That was during the Shah's regime, people had greater economic rights, people had greater social and cultural rights. So everything had improved during the Shah's regime compared to what we have now. The new regime, once they took power, they monopolized the political power, they promised democracy, but then excluded everybody that challenged them or competed against them, became rivals. And then they also seized the economic assets of the country. The vast majority of the assets are now, more than 50% are controlled by the clergy. Another about 25% to 40% controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. The part of the economy is controlled by the state. The private sector basically has disappeared. Of course, many of these things, Iranians, both men and women, have been resisting against what the Islamic Republic did and imposed all those restrictions upon the population.
But how can we eventually see democracy return to Iran?
They need to go on strikes. So the working class and the merchant class should shut down the economy, should shut down the factories, businesses, all of those things. And that would paralyze the economy, and that would render the regime completely vulnerable to overthrow. Becomes much easier. So once the regime is isolated, they would have to repress the people. Once the regime confronts all these strikes and protests, they would have to bring their repressive forces. And those repressive forces that belong to the Revolutionary Guard, which is a main part of the support for the regime, and the Basij, which is a paramilitary force, along with the police, they would not be enough to repress them. So they would have to bring the army out. Once they bring the army out, more than 90% of the army are conscript, and they would most unlikely shoot the people. And that will bring an end to the regime that has been repressing its own people for almost 4 decades now.
Now, in this desperation to maintain power, what would the likelihood be that, like Assad in Syria, how likely would this regime be to use chemical weapons against its own people?
Well, it would be sort of difficult for them to reach that kind of situation. And the main reason is that...
But would they do it? Is it beyond them, or would they actually do something like that?
It's for right now, nobody is really talking about. We are not even sure to what extent they're equipped, and they are already prepared to do it. We don't have any sign that the regime is ready to bring out chemical weapons and use it against its own people. But they do their regular repression, shooting people, arresting them, putting them in jail, torture, and killing them while they're in jail. Over 20 people were killed during the recent protest in the street.
What do you think the United States should do? What should our policy be towards Iran?
The United States should make sure that doesn't do anything that would unite the Iranian people, ending up supporting the regime. Ayatollah Khomeini's regime was almost overthrown when finished 1980, 1981. Saddam Hussein attacked, and that ended up uniting the people and the government fighting against an external enemy. That's one important thing that the United States should be very careful to prevent. Right now, they are very divided. It's very polarized. The regime is becoming increasingly isolated, and the regime actually would like to have an external enemy, which is always death to America and death to Israel and so forth.
So how would pulling out of the nuclear deal then affect that?
The nuclear deal is not a major concern for the vast majority of Iranians, but the issue is that for them is the issue of human rights and freedom and democracy. And whether they pull out or not pull out, for Iranians, the vast majority of them is to get rid of the regime. This policy, this treaty and the other treaty with external powers is not the issue.
Okay, so keep pressing for human rights and democracy in Iran. We're out of time, but Dr. Misagh Parsa, we thank you so much for sharing your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.